Hi, welcome to the Jansen Report. Today is June 24th, 2014, and I'm very honored to announce to you that tonight I have Dr. Paul Craig Roberts for you in this special interview about his book, How America Was Lost and Why He Wrote It, and the big picture out there, people who are controlling the grid, the powers that be. So we're going to zoom in on that, and what I would like to do is to paint a bigger picture of what's going on in the world. And well, who better to ask than Dr. Paul Craig Roberts? I'm going to give you a visual right now. Hello, Paul. How are you doing?
Hey, Marco. I'm fine, thank you.
Great. Well, I just introduced you. In fact, there's a lot more to say about you. I just pulled up your website here, and you've had an amazing career. And I've seen other interviewers also talk about that, so I won't get into that too deeply. But one of the most important things, I guess, is that in fact, you were a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and father of Reaganomics, as I saw it there. So that's very impressive.
I've had a lot of things to do so far.
Yes, I see you out there on the internet very often, talking about the things that are going on in the world. So, yeah, really, the first question that I would like to ask you is, you wrote a book, you wrote multiple books, in fact, and this one, the last one you did was How America Was Lost. And I'm wondering, why did you write that book?
Well, Marco, actually, what happened there? The previous book, The Failure of Laissez-Faire Capitalism and Economic Dissolution of the West, was published first in Germany. Then it was published here, and now it's coming out in Chinese. And the German publisher of that book accumulated several hundred of my columns over the last, 8 years, and put them together in a book. They were translated in German and put together the book, and then he told me he was about to publish
Okay.
this book, and I said, "Oh well, glad you did that," and all so on. And I got to thinking, well, probably we should do the same thing in English. So I asked him to send me what were the columns he had chosen. My German's kind of rusty, but I was able to go by the dates and establish which ones he'd chosen. And this was about 6 months later, so I was able to change around the selection somewhat, to take repetition out for the most part, and to pull it together with an introduction and a conclusion. And so it really wasn't a decision I made, it was a decision made by a German publisher.
Okay.
And what the book does, of course, is it shows how liberty in the United States, as established or as exists in the U.S. Constitution, has been destroyed, and that the 800-year struggle of the English for liberty, which was inherited by the American colonials and which they put into the Constitution, this no longer exists in the United States. Things like habeas corpus.
Right. Yeah.
Means that the government cannot just detain you indefinitely in a dungeon without giving some account of itself to a court of law, without some evidence, without a conviction. Now, this no longer exists in the United States. Due process, the right to attorney, the right to actually defend your evidence yourself against charges with evidence.
Yeah.
All of the war on terror has destroyed all of these rights. And then Obama, the current president, declared yet a new absurdity. He said that as president, he can kill American citizens without due process of law. He doesn't need any evidence in court. He doesn't need a conviction of a capital crime. He can simply exterminate you if he or some member of his executive branch thinks that you might in some way be associating with terrorists.
Right.
So right to life is now gone. You can be murdered by the president on false information or on whim or for whatever reason it might exist. So the world doesn't seem to be aware of this. They don't seem to be aware that in the United States today, at the present time, there exists probably the most complete police state in the history of the world. Now, the reason they don't recognize it is because this police state so far is being used against only a few demonized people. American citizens who are of Muslim ethnicity or religion or descent, who criticize U.S. foreign policy. It's been applied to them. It's been applied to whistleblowers who reveal government crimes. Whistleblowers in the United States are actually protected in law so that they can reveal government crimes. But this protection no longer means anything because it's ignored by the president, by the Congress, by the courts. And so these whistleblowers not only do not enjoy the law that protects them, they don't enjoy any of the constitutional principles that protect them. So we have the police state measures falling on whistleblowers. Now, of course, the whistleblower has been redefined by Washington. They are now terrorist sympathizers or traitors or spies.
Right. The war on terror, right?
Yeah. In other words, Bradley Manning or Julian Assange, who wasn't even an American, but Edward Snowden.
Yes.
So whistleblowers are no longer whistleblowers, they're spies, terrorists, or traitors. So for the American public, they don't get concerned. Oh, he's just a traitor, or he's just a spy, or he's just a Muslim friendly to terrorists. So the vast bulk of the population doesn't experience the police state. Now, the next group that's beginning to experience the police state are critics, war protesters, Occupy protesters, even journalists who are finding that they now have to reveal their sources, such as the New York fellow, Rosen, I think it is, who's now ordered to reveal his sources for a chapter in the book, or he may be arrested and imprisoned. So we're seeing the First Amendment rights, the protection that journalists have always enjoyed in the United States. Remember the Pentagon Papers when they were leaked during the Vietnam War, during the Nixon administration?
Yeah.
They weren't able to do anything to this journalist as much as they wanted to and try, because he was protected by the Constitution. Well, all of these kinds of protections now have been cast aside. So the police state, as Washington comes in for more criticism, as its crimes become more well known, people who try to hold the government to account, to law, will find that they are now the next range of victims of the American police state. So what this book does is it shows the development of this, how it's based in the war on terror, and how you first make a move against terrorists, and then how this becomes generalized, and how then everybody becomes subject to the laws of rights. And this is indeed the case in the United States, and it's happened without any interference to speak of from the federal courts. The Supreme Court has actually pushed it along, helped it actually. Congress has not done anything about it. In fact, Congress has actually codified into law some of the presidential violations of the Constitution, assertions of executive authority over the Constitution. And so we have this curious situation where the world looks at the United States and says, oh, that's the home of democracy, liberty, and freedom. It most certainly is not any longer.
No, no.
So that's what really the book achieves. It shows the story, how it happened, all the individual instances and cases, and the fact that it was simply accepted by the legal profession, the bar associations, the law schools. There's been some objections from the American Civil Liberties Union, but they're mainly alone.
So you were saying that some groups of people, like mostly the critics, are being targeted right now. But what as I just told you, I'm based in the European Union, and what I get from people in the United States is that they do see some militarization going on with the police. The police are outfitted as soldiers or whatever. They have heavy equipment, many rounds of ammo, etc. So how do you see that?
Well, that's come also from the war on terror. The police are militarized. The origin of the SWAT team was to deal with a hostage situation where some dangerous armed figure had hostages whose lives might be in danger. And the SWAT team was what was supposed to be a more experienced way of negotiating with the hostage taker, but also have snipers, very good marksmen, who, if they were unable to convince the hostage taker to release them and give himself up, they could kill him. Well, that's the origin. Well, now they're used just on routine matters, just to deliver a warrant. That used to, the policeman would knock on your door, politely hand you the warrant. You were supposed to appear at court on a certain day. Now they come a dozen, outfit like commandos. They knock down your door. They throw in stun grenades so that you're stunned.
Yeah.
In the event that you're waiting, prepared to shoot them. They throw in tear gas. They use the most violent kinds of tactics. And about half the time, they're at the wrong address.
Right.
Almost every day, they kill some other innocent civilian for no reason. But they're never held accountable. The police now have the right to murder. And it happens every day.
Wow.
Every day. And they're always excused because they were following procedures. And the procedures are that every member of the public is a dangerous threat to police, and the life of the police is so precious, he must take no chances with his life, and therefore he must use maximum force against the public in the event that the public has ill intentions against the policeman. So the public is increasingly brutalized. They're murdered, they're beat, they're tasered, they're maced, they get tear gas. The other day, the police, the SWAT team broke into a home. They thought it was the home of a drug dealer, it was the home of a family. They threw a stun grenade into the crib where the baby was, blew his face off.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
They always shoot the family dog. They brutalize everybody in the house. And this just instant after instant after instant. The other day, I was writing for Gerald Celenti's Trends Journal on the militarization of the police, and I Googled police brutality. Up came millions of videos of police brutality. Now, that's only the ones that are caught. A lot of police brutality is not videoed.
I know, yeah.
And I'm talking about huge numbers, millions of these. So we now have a situation in the United States where the police are a far greater threat to the public than are the criminals.
Right. Yeah. So that brings us to the question. I mean, all these things are going on within the U.S., outside of the U.S. Of course, there are wars going on, and of course, we've had many wars, but it seems to be getting worse. And the question that I get from a lot of people is, why on earth is all of this happening? Is it an organization that's behind all of this, or what's the explanation for that? Who is controlling this, in other words?
The real explanation is the neoconservative doctrine that history chose the United States to exercise hegemony over the world, that the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet collapse, is proof that there's no alternative to the American economic and political system. And since history has chosen the United States to prevail over the world, the United States has carte blanche. It is above law, above morality, above treaties. Its only obligation is to extend its hegemony, that it's exceptional, indispensable, and the rest of the world is inferior. And therefore, Washington cannot be held to account by anyone, or by law, or by any treaties. And so this came out of the Soviet collapse. It's akin to Marx's view that history chose the proletariat, not the capitalists. And therefore, whatever the proletariat did to establish their rule was above law or crime or sin or murder or anything. Well, that's what the neoconservatives, they have the same view. Of course, it has different roots than Marx's version, but it comes to the same thing in practice. And so this came out of the Soviet collapse. Now, this ideology suited a lot of people. It suited the military security complex, because now there was open-ended appropriations for armaments, and it gave the opportunity for new powers to accumulate in the security apparatus. And of course, 9/11 gave them the terrorist excuse, so that in order to be safe from terrorists, Americans need a police state.
Okay.
It takes a police state to make you safe. So, and then we have the Israel lobby. Now, the Israel lobby is very closely tied to the neoconservatives. Essentially, they're the same people. And many of them are also the same people in the military security complex, and also in Goldman Sachs and the Wall Street crowd.
The bankers.
So it's sort of the same people with four pillars.
Yep.
And so we had two releasing events: the Soviet collapse and 9/11.
Okay. Yeah.
So this has unleashed America on the world. And it began in the Middle East because that was most convenient for Israel. And it was also tied to the alleged perpetrators of 9/11. So that was the first place to convince the public that you could exercise these new rights to bomb, to invade, without being charged with a war crime.
Right, right.
So that's where it came from. It is not a conspiracy by some group or some long-standing plan. It's how these four interests are all served by these same opportunities that, once again, repeating myself, resulted from the Soviet collapse, which unleashed the ideology, and from 9/11, which was blamed on Muslim terrorists, and therefore made the Middle East the prime place where these powers would be first applied, and led to the domestic police state in order to have surveillance over terrorists so Americans would be safe.
Okay. So what's your take on the following statement, that this seems to be superseding the president's? It seems to be, I mean, that's a theory that I've heard many times from other people that I've interviewed as well, is that this seems to be, like I said, superseding the level of the president. So is there a force behind it? You said, well, I don't believe in that there's a group, an organized group behind it going back ages, but what about all these presidents talking about the New World Order? Is that the agenda that we see here, or is there a different explanation for this?
I think there's a different explanation.
Okay.
The New World Order is Wall Street's way of exercising financial hegemony over the rest of the world, and the American corporate way of exercising hegemony. What under the guise of the New World Order, what happened was American jobs were offshore, manufacturing, industrial jobs, and also the tradable professional services, such like software engineering, research, design. These can now be done anywhere because of the high-speed internet, and they could be done much cheaper in India or China. And so the profits of the firms went up as their labor costs dropped. This pleased Wall Street, it pleased shareholders, and it pleased the executives who got performance-related bonuses. In the United States, the salary of an executive is limited in law to $1 million annually, if it is to be deducted as a business expense. Unless the salary is performance-based, then there's no cap. It can be anything. It has been.
Yeah.
So, for example, a few years ago, there was one manager of a hedge fund. He was paid $1.5 billion for the year.
Wow. That's amazing.
So to get back to the point, the financial hegemony was achieved through globalism, because this then gave American banks supremacy everywhere, and the corporations were able to recruit all the cheap labor in areas that have a massive overhang of labor supply on the labor market. So this is where the American profits come from. There's no growth in American consumer income for at least 2 decades. So there can't be profits from consumer spending. There's no growth in real retail sales. There's no growth in the workforce. In fact, the participation rate in the workforce has been falling.
Yes.
And so we only this last month, I think, have as many people employed as we had employed in 2008. But in the meantime, we've had years of population growth, and of course there's no jobs for them.
No.
So we're falling behind on every count, and yet the corporations are profitable in this because they have offshored their labor. So the New World Order is a way that the United States corporations and Wall Street organize trade agreements that give them carte blanche.
Right, such as the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with Europe, and the TPP with the Pacific region?
Yeah.
Right, yes, yeah. That does seem like a corporate takeover. If you
Yes, what they both do is they make the American corporations immune to the laws of the countries in which they operate.
Yes.
And it means that a country like France, for example, that bans GMOs, genetically modified foods, under this agreement, that is illegal because it's restrained trade. And therefore, France would have to repeal all those laws or face penalties or lawsuits from Monsanto or whoever.
Right.
So it's a way of extending Washington's hegemony. And in that sense, yes, it's a plot.
Definitely, yeah. Yes, because it even becomes illegal to grow your own vegetables, I guess, if that trade agreement is going to be in place.
It could do.
It could, yes.
Interpret it however they wish.
Right. So you were talking about the New World Order more as a way of Wall Street and a global corporate takeover by American corporations mostly. How does the monetary system tie in with that? Because I've been studying the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and different central banks across the globe. And what I found is that the Federal Reserve was started in 1913 in an illegal fashion. At least that's what I got from the evidence that I saw. And what happened there, I guess, is, and I would love to hear your take on this, but is that it is a takeover by bankers to control the currency supply and to be able to control the population through the currency supply as well, because it allows them to print money and to earn interest on this money and to take wealth away from the people, as you see happening all over the place right now. How do you see this?
Well, I think that there was a plot, and the plot was to secure a way of expanding credit. I think that was the limit of the plot when the Federal Reserve was formed. The banks wanted a way that credit could be increased, because the more you can increase it, the cheaper it is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it would reduce their borrowing costs. And the Federal Reserve is also set up to be the lender of last resort, such that if a bank gets in trouble, the Federal Reserve comes in with the cash to be sure it can meet any withdrawals by depositors, or that it can meet any liabilities that would otherwise cause a failure of the bank. So from the banker's standpoint, they acted to protect themselves from failure, from their own mistakes, and they acted in order to get a cheap and plentiful source of credit. So I think that was the limit to their plot. I don't think they had any idea about eluding consumers and controlling the population. Of course, the American population was against a central bank because they didn't trust Washington, the central authority, and it was too much central authority. And the American population was always against a national bank. So they dressed the Fed up as a private bank. They said, oh, this isn't a government bank. This is not a national bank. This is a private bank, and it's owned by all these bankers, and so it's not a government organization. So that's the reason the Fed has some of the peculiar characteristics it has. That's the real reason. There are other explanations and conspiracies, but that's what they had to do to get this thing accepted, because people didn't trust a national bank. In the EU, the situation is quite different. The European Central Bank is used to destroy the sovereignty of the individual countries.
Yes.
Because none of all these countries that are in the EU, they still have central banks, but they can't do anything. They can't create money. They can't make loans to the government. So we see the plight of Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain and Ireland, because they don't have any way for a bank to serve as lender to the government. There's nobody to step in to support the government's bonds. And so this gives control to private bankers. And then how did the Greek government get funded? They had to sell bonds to private banks.
Yep.
But it didn't have any central bank to fall back on in the event of difficulty. And there's no way that Greece can expand the money supply to get out of its indebtedness. So this basically strips countries of their sovereignty. The EU countries are kind of like American states. Florida New York, they don't have their own central banks.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for your take on that. Um, but what you see in the financial markets is that there seems to be inflation in the markets where there's no real inflation in the real economy as we call it. But it seems to be the case that banks can use this free money that they get from the Federal Reserve, for instance, to buy stocks in the equities market, and that elevates the level of the stock market to a certain point where it's really a bubble. What's your opinion on that? What is going to happen in the near future with the financial markets? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, sure. Keep in mind, Marco, this is a new development. Um, this came out of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
The financial crisis came out of the deregulation, which began in the second term of Bill Clinton. The financial deregulation began with the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Right. Yeah.
The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial from investment banks, and it was not possible under the Glass-Steagall Act for a bank to use depositors' money for speculative purposes. So when the banks got that repealed during Clinton's second term, that was a big change in the nature of the financial system in the United States and in the behavior of financial actors. They can now be far more reckless, and they can now use depositors' money for speculative purposes. And then the next thing they did, they prevented the federal regulatory agency that had the authority from regulating over-the-counter derivatives. When Brooks Bourne, who was the head of the Commodities Futures Trading Corporation, which was supposed to regulate derivatives, tried to regulate the derivatives, Greenspan, the Federal Reserve Chairman, the head of the SEC, Larry Summers, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and the Secretary at the time, who was it? It was his name starts with an R, keeps my memory for a moment. They all went to Congress and said, don't let this woman do this. It's a threat to the financial system.
Right, yeah.
Financial markets are self-regulating. They started spewing all of this absurd, libertarian, free market garbage. And it sounded good to Congress. They had heard a little bit of this type of thing from us in the Reagan administration.
Yes, yeah.
They heard a lot more from the banks during the Clinton. And now they were hearing it from the Federal Reserve itself, from the Securities and Exchange Commission itself, from the Treasury Department itself. All the markets are self-regulated. Get out of the way. Don't let Brooks Bourne perform her statutory duties and regulate these derivatives. It'll be a mess if she does. Leave them unregulated. So you can see then how the banks were now able to take a massive debt leverage.
Right.
And
yeah.
they didn't understand these instruments either. And then the next thing they did, they took the position limits off of speculators. Historically, in the United States, speculators were limited to a small percentage of the market because no one wanted them to corner the market. The function of a speculator was to achieve allocation of commodities over time. Like a big supply comes this time of year, and it needs to be priced such that it stays a smooth price over time, so that you don't have a surplus of stuff and the price goes low, and then as the year passes, there's nothing left, there's a shortage, and the price goes high. So this was the function, always the function of speculation in the United States, but this was changed early in the 21st century. And the limits on speculators' positions were removed. So now they can control any market. Any oil, gold, aluminum, any metal, silver, pork bellies.
Oh. I guess we're losing connection here. We're going to try to get it back.
You still there?
Yes, there was a little hiccup.
Your video is gone. Is mine still there?
No, I guess it's gone. So,
Well, let me see if I can bring mine back.
yes. Well, you're back. So, let's take it from here.
So all of this is essentially happened since 1998, what you were talking about. It's not something that's always been part of the system. It was created by events. It was created by irresponsible financial deregulation, by a libertarian ideology that's hogwash, and it was created by the financial crisis because they had allowed banks to absorb one another, so that we now have 4 or 5 banks, and the financial position of the banks, the assets under their control, are larger than entire economies.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So the argument is we can't let them fail. Another development is that it is the management, the former executives of these 4 biggest banks that run the federal regulatory agencies, that run the Federal Reserve, that run the U.S. Treasury. So you have the people who caused the problem as bankers now in the go running the policy. Well, they clearly are going to protect their banks.
Exactly. Yeah.
Protect themselves from any criticism. And so this is where the quantitative easing came from, the zero interest rates for the banks. It's a new thing. It's unprecedented. It never happened before. The Federal Reserve never before. When they would buy bonds, it was to have an impact on the money supply. If they were going to buy bonds, they wanted to expand the money supply. So they would, the reserves of banks would change. Instead of holding bonds, they now have cash, and so they would lend more. And if they sold bonds, this was to drain reserves from the system, to reduce the inflation or the economic growth that might be fueling inflation. And it was known as open market operations. And they were very limited, and that was the purpose. But for the last however many years it is, 6, I guess, we've had the Federal Reserve print, some years, $1 trillion in new money.
Yes. Yeah.
They not only buy U.S. treasuries in order to finance the large budget that Washington has, but half of that was allocated to purchasing mortgage-backed securities. That is, to the toxic financial instruments on the books of the banks. So if the Fed purchases these instruments, it drives up their price too. And if their price rises, so does the balance sheet of the banks. So the whole function of quantitative easing has always been to support the balance sheets of the banks. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with stimulating the economy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Causing recovery. That's why we don't have a recovery.
So how is this going to end up for the people in the United States and beyond?
Well, that remains to be seen. The downside of this policy for the United States is that since the end of World War II, the dollar has been the world reserve currency. This means there are holdings of dollars in vast amounts all over the world.
Right.
There are reserves of central banks. There are all kinds of investors who are invested in dollar-denominated assets. There are even primitive peoples who have their savings in dollar currency, wads of dollars. And now, for the last 6 years, the Federal Reserve has been creating dollars at a fantastic rate, but the supply of goods and services in the United States is not growing at anything like the same rate. So what this does is this dilutes the existing holders of dollars, just like excessive stock issuance dilutes the shareholders of that stock. Well, the Fed has been diluting the holders of dollars all over the world, the foreign central banks, everybody. for 6 years, and people are starting to wonder what is the value of my dollar holdings when they keep printing new dollars. It's not like these new dollars are backed by an increase in goods and services. It's not. And so this is raising doubts about the dollar as reserve currency. We've had them expressed forcibly by the BRICS: Brazil, India, China, Russia, South Africa.
Yeah.
We have had bilateral currency arrangements made where countries now settle their trade imbalances in their own currencies without using the dollar. We've had the Russian-Chinese energy deal in which the dollar is not par. There's no dollars in the payments system. And so we're starting to see this move away from the dollar. And we've also now had the economic advisor to Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, saying that the only way that American military aggression can be stopped is to de-dollarize the world. That is, we have to bring down the dollar by ceasing to use it so that the demand for dollars in the exchange markets collapses, and with it the dollar price, and people abandon the dollar, and there goes Washington's power. So the main source of Washington's power is the dollar is the reserve currency. This means two things. One, it means Washington can always pay its bills by printing money. And the other thing it means is that since it is a dollar-based payment system, Washington can impose its will on other countries with sanctions. If you don't have a dollar-based system, there's no way Washington can put sanctions on anything. And so the Russians and Chinese have finally caught on. They've been using a system that gives Washington power over them. And why are they doing it? They don't need it. And so you could see that there is a successful move away from the dollar, a reduction in the dollar's value, the collapse of the what remains of the Bretton Woods system. And this then would greatly curtail the ability of the United States to act as a hegemon, to dictate to the world, to have financial hegemony. The whole thing would come down. So that could be a result. I think it would be a good result, even though it would be very hard on Americans, because the United States now is a heavily import-dependent country.
Yes.
And
yeah.
so if the dollar collapses or loses value substantially, the prices of the imports go up. So you would have a huge inflation, and yet there's no growth in American incomes. So the living standard would take a huge knock. A lot of people are already suffering here.
Yes.
And it would become very difficult just to make ends meet. So, but still, it might save the world from war and from the arrogance of Washington.
So let's hope for that positive effect to happen. But let's also hope that United States, well, at least the people in the United States aren't going to suffer too much. But from my research findings, it becomes evident, at least to me and to some other people that I'm talking to worldwide, that there is going to be a collapse of the dollar, and that this is going to harm the international markets, and therefore also is going to hurt a lot of people in their private wallets, not just in the United States, but I guess also in Europe and in other Western nations. So this could be a big problem. And my question is, when do you see this happening? Do you see a collapse in the short term?
It's gone on longer than I thought it could, but everything is now rigged.
It is.
The bond market is rigged by the Fed purchases of bonds. The gold market is rigged by the shorting, the naked shorting on COMEX.
Yes.
The futures contracts. It's the same for silver. The stock market is rigged because every time it starts to turn down, the plunge protection team steps in and buys S&P futures.
Yes.
Drives it back up.
Yep.
And the dollar is rigged because the Japanese print yen with which to buy dollars to support the dollar. The European Central Bank was forced to do the same thing. The British pound. And for years and years, the Chinese did it themselves, stupidly,
Yeah. Yes.
trying to protect their currency from rising. So the Chinese peg to the dollar was supported by heavy Chinese purchases of dollars. So you had the Chinese government undermining itself.
Yeah. Yes.
And as far as I know, the Russians did it. I don't know. But so many of these rigged elements are still in place, and what's going to take them away? And I don't know what's going to take them away. Remains to be seen. My personal belief is that the world is not threatened by the collapse of the dollar. Only America, or the few other countries who use the dollar as their own domestic currency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think, is it Bolivia or Ecuador? One of those countries uses the dollar. Now, because you don't need a world reserve currency any longer. The dollar had that role after World War II because the United States was the only country that wasn't destroyed. Nobody else had any industrial capacity, any manufacturing capability. Russia's destroyed, Germany's destroyed, Japan's destroyed, England's destroyed. There was nothing. China's a third world country. This was many, many decades ago. We now have many viable economies. They can settle their trade in their own currency. What do you need to be paid in dollars instead of euros or won or rubles or whatever? You don't.
Right.
You don't.
I guess.
And so I think the world that will emerge, Marco, will be a world in which there's no reserve currency. I don't think this talk about the SDR being the new reserve currency is right. The SDR itself is 65% dollars.
Right.
So it's not a change.
No, but I guess the Chinese have been talking about their renminbi as possibly the new reserve currency, but that remains to be seen, of course.
I don't think they want that.
No.
I think that what the Chinese want, the Russians want, the BRICS, is simply they're going to settle their trade in their own currencies. And so this forces discipline on each country that wants its currency accepted so it can settle its trade imbalances. And that means they can't simply inflate. So I think that the reserve currency was unique in time, followed the destruction of World War II. What other currency was there? None.
No.
Dollar. That was it. And so, and not only that, when this system was put into place, foreign central banks could convert their dollar holdings into gold. Now that was taken out in 1971 by President Nixon.
Yes.
And so we've just had a paper dollar standard, and it's been abused, and it's used to bully people. It's used to achieve hegemony over them, to sanction them. And it's been abused by the creation of dollars in the last 6 years. It's phenomenal. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from something like 800 billion to 3.5 trillion.
I guess it's over 4 trillion by now.
Yeah, probably 4 trillion.
Over 4
So
trillion.
the whole thing is, and continuing.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that the United States will be able to hold this together for considerable time because Japan is a puppet state, it's a vassal, especially now with China rising. What can Japan do? It's even more dependent on the United States. Europe, these are vassal states. I hope you don't think Netherlands is an independent country.
I know it isn't. So
No,
yeah.
neither is Germany nor France.
True.
Nor is Great Britain. These are American puppet states.
Yes.
Their governments report to Washington. They're not responsible to the people in Europe. They're responsible to Washington. And that's why they always support Washington's crimes. That's why there's no summoning of Bush and Cheney and Obama to the War Crimes Tribunal.
I guess Belgium just bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of bonds, American bonds, for some reason. So there's something going on there, definitely.
Clearly Belgium didn't buy them because Belgium has a trade deficit and a deficit in its domestic budget and hasn't any money.
Right. Well, something happened there, maybe some accounting trick.
Took off the bonds, the Federal Reserve, and they laundered them through Belgium.
Right, yeah.
Because they didn't want people, they're trying to make people think they're tapering. And they had just announced a taper, and if they had to turn around and buy these bonds, then the amount of bonds they were buying for the next several months were larger even than the initial quantitative easing. So it would have wrecked the whole image they were creating. So my colleague and I think we established that there was no other source of money to absorb the $130 billion in bonds. Certainly not Belgium. It was that amount is something like a third of Belgium's GDP.
Right. Yes. It was amazing. Yeah. So so you're saying it was a laundering action from.
It was a laundering action so that it wouldn't look like the Fed was buying it.
Right. Yeah.
Because they were creating to take pressure off the dollar from quantitative easing. They were creating the image of, look, we're cutting back QE. We're cutting it back 10 billion a month. It's going to go to zero.
Yep.
You don't have to worry about the dollar anymore. See, we're stopping these purchases. And so if all of a sudden they had to step in and buy something like $120 billion in bonds, that would, and you add that on top of the quantitative purchases that they were buying, then it would have blown their propaganda scheme. So I think that's clear what happened.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you for your take on that. So what's going to happen from here? We've talked in the beginning of this conversation. We've talked about the police state domestically within the United States. I briefly touched upon the wars going on in the world, of course, directed by the United States. Also, what's happening in Ukraine, of course, is a big issue right now. So where is all of this going? What's your take on that?
That's a good question. We can wrap up with that.
Yes.
We've been going on quite some time.
I guess we have.
Here is the take on it. First, let's deal with the Middle East, the rise of ISIS or ISIL. All those Middle Eastern borders are artificial. They were created by the British and French after World War I. It's the former Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans fought on the side of Germany in World War I, and so they lost their empire to the French and British. And the French and British sat down, just like they did with Africa, and drew all these stupid fake borders that don't make any real sense. They did that in the Middle East. And so you have countries in the Middle East which have populations that are enemies for centuries. Sunnis and the Shia, and other things are thrown in, Kurds in some cases, other kinds of ethnic peoples, but mainly the Shia and the Sunnis. So in some states, the Sunnis are the majority and the Shia are the minority. In other states, it's the reverse. And so what you see happen, what the United States did when it went into the Middle East, and some of us warned, we just weren't listening to. What they did, they destroyed the secular rules that set on all this religious intolerance among Muslims. Saddam Hussein was secular. He was not Islamic rule.
Mm-hmm.
Assad in Syria is secular. It's not Islamic rule. Essentially, Gaddafi essentially was secular. He spoke a good Islamic tone, but it was essentially a secular state. So when you destroy these people, you unleash the religious tensions and the disunity between Sunnis and Shia, and they're now creating states, again, with borders that reflect who lives in them. So what you see, they call it ISIS sometimes, ISIS,
yes.
ISIL, they're creating a new state that's part Syria, part Iraq. Old Iraq and old Syria, if they succeed, are gone. There'll be some part of Syria that's somebody else, some part of Iraq that's Shia, but this new state will be part of Syria, part of Iraq. It'll be a Sunni state.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's what's happened. That's what's going on there. And they seem to be very determined, very fierce. It sort of reminds me of the origin of Islam, when all of a sudden Muhammad appeared on the scene, and the Arabs were overrunning the Byzantine Empire. This came out of nowhere. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody expected it. Least of all the Eastern Roman Empire, which soon found that it was losing territory in heaps and gobs. So, in a way, this caught everybody off guard, except for a few of us who knew this was what would happen, because the United States could not prevail. It couldn't even occupy Baghdad.
Right.
After 8 years, in 13 years in Afghanistan, and it's been defeated by a few thousand lightly armed Taliban and run out of the country.
That's amazing, huh?
So clearly they couldn't prevail over this fierce animosity between the Shia and the Sunni. So that's that part. Now, the Ukraine, this is the American neoconservative ideology that is expressed in the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine, let me read it to you. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, this is Paul Wolfowitz, he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He set the basis for American foreign and military policy.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is what it is. This is a direct quote from Wolfowitz, from his doctrine. Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. This is the dominant consideration underlying the new defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. In other words, we're not going to permit the rise of Russia or China.
Exactly.
It's not going to be permitted.
So that's what this agenda is all about.
That's what the agenda, that's what the pivot to Asia is about, what the construction of the new American naval and air bases from the Philippines to Vietnam is about. It's what breaking the Reagan-Gorbachev agreements about no NATO in Eastern Europe is about. It's what America leaving the ABM treaty with Russia is about. It's what the change in U.S. strategic nuclear doctrine is about. We've now changed our strategic doctrine. Nuclear weapons are no longer a retaliatory force. They are a preemptive first strike. It's what the ABM missile bases on Russia's border are about. It's what Ukraine is about, Georgia is about, Azerbaijan.
Right.
This is to prevent the rise of Russia and China. And so, since the United States has no diplomacy, it relies on coercion, threat, violence. What does the State Department tell these countries? Do as we say, or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. How many times have you heard that? That's what the State Department tells. That's what they told Pakistan not long ago, remember?
Yeah.
Do as we say. Go attack your own peoples, or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. Why attack your own? We're suspicious they may be helping the Taliban. You go bomb them, or we'll bomb you in the Stone Age. Now, that's not diplomacy. That's force. That's coercion. What does Putin do? I'm here for you. Let's work it out. We can find a solution.
Yes. He's trying to use diplomacy, yeah.
He's trying to use diplomacy against force. He's hoping to convince Germany, France, look, I'm not the cause of the problem. I'm reasonable. I'm not doing provocative things. You're being pushed into a conflict in behalf of the American empire. How is that in your interest? Look at our trade relations. how are you benefiting from America's war for hegemony? You're pawns.
Yeah, definitely
You're
true.
going to get dropped. How much pushing do you think Russia can take?
Yes,
What
this.
kind of war will this be with two nuclear powers? A war neither side can afford to lose.
Exactly. So how is this going to end? Final question.
Well, either the insane neoconservatives who rule in Washington are going to blow the world up and destroy life on Earth, or Putin's diplomacy is going to need help from Europe. The Europeans are going to have to tell Washington, well, look, this is going too far. We're not prepared to take these kinds of risks so that you can bully everybody.
Right? Yeah.
And the question is, can they do